Nanos was paid by CTV to actually come up with this sort of poll and potentially this result. What else have they been asked, and who else have they been paid by? So if you didn't know this, this might surprise you.
Fresh off Sean Chen's resignation, a new hit piece broke today on CTV News, and they didn't hold back. They referenced a bunch of anonymous MPs having concerns and tried to tie it all back to a recent Nanos poll. But we dug a little bit deeper, and there are a lot of problems with that, and potentially the way the poll was commissioned.
Let's take a look. Conservative MPs worried about losing their seats privately question Poilievre's leadership ability to defeat Mark Carney. Well, here we go, folks.
Ottawa. Several Conservative MPs are privately expressing deep concerns about Pierre Poilievre's leadership, with some telling CTV News they do not believe he will still be leading the party when the next federal election is called. CTV News spoke to 17 members of the Conservative caucus from all regions of the country, and all were granted anonymity to speak candidly about the party's challenges and internal concerns. Specifically, MPs were asked about a recent Nanos research poll commissioned by CTV News, which concluded that Prime Minister Mark Carney has, quote, no obvious challenger, end quote, when presented with a list of Conservative politicians. According to the poll, 33% of Canadians surveyed said, quote, none can defeat, end quote, Carney. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, meanwhile, received 16% support, while Poilievre garnered 15% of the vote. All but two of the Conservative MPs who spoke with CTV News agreed with the Nanos assessment. While Poilievre remains popular in the West, particularly in Alberta, they are pessimistic about any Conservative leader beating Carney in a general election. They don't necessarily blame Poilievre for the party's difficulties, but they also offered candid, bleak assessments of the Conservatives' position after spending time with constituents across the country this summer. 5 MPs pointed to Ontario as a particular problem area, saying that some traditional Conservative voters have warmed to Carney and his leadership. One MP put it plainly, quote, we are in real trouble in Ontario, end quote. When asked what would happen if an election were called tomorrow, the MP responded, quote, I don't even want to think about that, end quote. Another MP who represents a rural riding in the province described growing dissatisfaction with Poilievre among seniors and women, but said there is still time for the party to recover. The same MP also described a by-election that has yet to be called in Brantford, Ontario, after Larry Brock announced last week he will step down in September as a key test for the party. The riding has been Conservative since 2008, and the MP said if the Conservatives can't hold that seat, Poilievre's leadership will be in serious peril. Speaking to CTV News, the Ontario MP likened the situation to the Liberals' loss in Toronto's St. Paul's in 2024, a defeat widely seen as a turning point that accelerated pressure on then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau before he stepped down as Liberal leader.
Now, the article goes on and on and on, and we're not going to show you the whole thing. But there's a couple of interesting parts that I found about that. So right off the bat, they're specifically framing this around the Nanos leadership poll.
You know, the poll that they paid for.
Right. So how this poll came to be, this isn't the normal cadence that Nanos does. CTV specifically commissioned this poll from Nanos. Now, here are the basic results from the poll. So this is what you see. Which Conservative can beat Mark Carney? Canadians say 33% none can defeat Mark Carney, 16% Stephen Harper, 15% Pierre, and 11% Doug Ford. That tells you all you need to know. We started digging into this a little bit deeper, and it's a bit strange how they would kind of frame this, because you're asking people to select a list from a list of people as to who can beat Mark Carney. And so you're saying, here's Mark Carney. This is the guy. And then I'm going to give you multiple different Conservatives that you're supposed to choose from. So immediately you're actually loading the poll in favor of Mark Carney. Because when you have a list of different people that are Conservatives, you're going to have different people from different regions saying, okay, if I have the choice, now I'm going to pick one or the other. So you're actually going to be splitting that vote across the right. It's the same thing that happened when you're looking at the Liberals versus the NDP. And if you asked, who are you going to vote for in the last election? If the NDP isn't an option, well, you're only going to vote for the Liberals. And the NDP took themselves out of the running. But when the NDP puts themselves as a viable option, it splits that vote. And the Liberals go from 41% down to maybe 30% or 25%, same as the NDP. This is what this poll is doing. Now it's a ranking system, but still, if you're saying, well, here's my top guy, well, then the rest of them don't really matter then, do they? So this is where it splits this all up. Why they're including Stephen Harper doesn't make sense. He hasn't campaigned in over 10 years, hasn't been involved with the party in over 10 years. So he hasn't really been in the public eye. Gee, I wonder why there's a bunch of people that aren't selecting Stephen Harper. And those that are actually voted for him. Now, there's other people that are selecting other names that aren't on this list, that aren't even in federal contention. Some of them, many Canadians may not have even heard of, but it's because they're locally known. So it's actually adding a lot of mess to this. The other aspect of this poll is that, well, they're polling the same group that they do for the cadence poll. So if you're getting a bunch of people that are 55 and up that voted for the Liberals in the last election, well, those are the same people that are going to say, absolutely, nobody can beat Mark Carney. Is that really telling you anything?
No, because again, these are just opinions. You're not looking at, well, Stephen Harper can beat Carney because he has these attributes, or Pierre Poilievre is going to beat Carney because he has these attributes. You're just kind of looking at, well, what do Canadians think? Sometimes what you think is not reality.
So what we did is we took that data in this leadership poll and we kind of mapped it so it's a little bit more visual. This is what we're talking about. So in the latest rolling poll, this is the federal poll that Nanos does by themselves, they're showing the personal numbers for Mark Carney as allegedly 56% and Poilievre at 18.4% for complete transparency. But then we get into the leadership poll. And you see here that by province, it gets kind of weird. So in Atlantic Canada, 43.2% allegedly of those surveyed are saying, well, absolutely, no one can beat Mark Carney. And the other high ones are in Ontario, allegedly, BC, and the Prairies is 29.1. So you see that Poilievre has a chance in those same demographics. The Prairies are the highest. And what's at the lowest? Atlantic Canada. But there's a big chunk that's actually missing. And that's because it's all distributed between these different conservatives. What would make more sense is actually if they didn't worry about Mark Carney and they just said, who's going to be the best leader of the conservatives, and use actual current politicians. There's no sense in putting Stephen Harper in there. This is almost like fantasy draft type of approach here.
Well, and if you recall, there was a poll recently, and you'll have to forgive me, I don't recall who put it out, but there was a poll that had said, who do you think is going to be better for these particular issues?
That was Abacus.
Yeah, and it was Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre. Like, that to me makes more sense than this current poll.
Well, and which party was going to be better handling each of these issues? And on the economy, guess what? None of them resulted in Mark Carney actually winning those issue polls. It was the Conservatives. So what does that say? Well, here's the thing. In the same week, you had Nanos saying that the Liberals were up 19 points. Angus Reid saying the Liberals were up 4 points. And Abacus saying that they were up 6 points. So who's right? They all have this standard of error.
I was going to say most of them have a standard of error that's usually like 2 or 3%.
Right. So, but if you use that standard deviation, that doesn't overlap at all between the 19 points and the 6 and the 4. So who's right? And this is why we say, you know what? Sure, polling, you can try to take some sort of, comfort from that. Maybe if all the polling is the same, across all of the different pollsters, because now you're getting multiple sample sizes, multiple methodologies, multiple different vendors doing the same type of poll. And if they're all in around 1 or 2%, then you can say, okay, yeah, I see it.
Well, and I think polling can have some benefits. For example, if you've ever been like in the war room during an election, they have usually a big map of the riding and it's broken down into the polling stations. And if you say, okay, this area right here, like these neighborhoods are very liberal heavy, that's where we need to concentrate more of our resources. That's where we need to hold more events. That's where we need to go door knocking more, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, I think they can have more use, but it doesn't necessarily predict the future.
Well, and it's interesting that CTV says, well, the conclusion of this was that there's no contender that can beat Mark Carney. Well, is that what that poll says?
No, not at all.
Right. So then they take that conclusion and then they say, based on this poll, do you agree? Well, that's kind of a loaded framing question now, isn't it?
It sure is.
So I don't really buy that. And especially because in some of the previous polling that Nanos has actually put out, there's a lot of seniors that are overrepresented in that. Now they say that they compensate for that. I'd be interested in understanding how they compensate for that. But it's the seniors that vote liberal are the ones that are most often answering the polls. And if you recall, we put out a video a little while ago from Abacus CEO David Coletto when he actually did this whole analysis where he broke down that there's a big problem in Canadian polling, and it's actually why the US pollsters say that, ours aren't as good, but conservatives are historically underrepresented in these polls.
Just because we're always working.
Right, and nobody's home to answer the polls. So, but there's some other things in there as well. They were talking about the recent resignation of Larry Brock and how it's super important that Poilievre win that riding.
It is super important that a conservative win that riding because, we said this when we heard Larry was stepping down. I don't recall if we said it on air, but we definitely said it to each other. This is a huge loss for the Conservative Party because not only is Larry a star MP, he's also a wonderful person. And the Conservatives are going to have to find somebody who is just as strong and just as caring about politics and the party and the community and Parliament and knows how to get things done. Because if they don't, I fear that they're going to be in trouble.
Well, and it's a strong voice that's not in Parliament that is prosecuting the Liberals and is holding them to account and that Canadians can trust, right? Larry built up a really strong following over the last few years that he's been there.
That's right. Like, honestly, again, we have so much respect for Mr. Brock and no one will ever be able to replace him, but I think the party, when they're selecting their candidate, needs to get very close.
Right. So we're going to do everything that we can to ensure that the riding stays blue after that by-election, whatever that is. We're going to be there to help. So, but we're not done this video yet, folks, because when it comes to the commissioning of this poll, there's a few things that I want to make sure that we take into account. Number one is what Bob Fife said recently.
You may be right in the sense that there's an unfair bias against the Conservatives in Ottawa. I think that's probably true, and it's always been the case, generally speaking.
That's why Tanya always says the city name at the top of these articles, because you know which bureau it came out of. This one came out of the Ottawa Bureau. So just want to put that out there that this is what Bob Fife is saying. He is a journalist insider. He's been there for decades.
Probably longer than I've been alive.
and this is him saying after he retired, oh yeah, there's absolutely a bias against the Conservatives, and there always has been. Stephen Harper even said something to that effect when he was on PragerU after the last election, and he pointed out that we have a very, very left-leaning media in Canada. Now, here's another thing, and I credit Vesper on X for finding this clip. It is very important because it's people that aren't beholden to any party right now, and they're talking about something that is very relevant to this video. So in this discussion, Dimitri Soudis is talking about a poll on politician salaries. And he points out that if you ask the same people a differently framed question, you can get very different results. His point is simple. The answer you get depends heavily on how you ask the question. Then he goes a step further and he says that during his time in politics, he remembers calling pollsters and essentially saying, I need a poll that gives me the following result. Go get it. And can you do it? So this is this clip, and this is all in French, but I gave you the rough translation of what's going on. But this is that clip, and for those that speak French, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Avec un sondage comme celui-là, si vous posez la question aux 74% qui est contre l'augmentation salariale, si vous étiez député, aimeriez-vous avoir 100 000 ou 130 000? Je vous assure que ce 74% serait très différent. Parce
OK,
que,
donc ça dépend de la question qu'on pose.
Oui, ça, c'est sûr.
Ben oui.
Ben
Puis,
oui,
puis
ça, c'est
écoutez, je me souviens, à mon époque, appeler des sondeurs pour leur dire « J'ai besoin d'un sondage qui me donne le résultat suivant. Peux-tu le faire, s'il vous plaît? » Donc,
Attendez, Dimitri, vous avez fait ça, vous?
ben oui.
OK.
So it's fascinating hearing somebody who worked in politics come on a show, and this is CBC Radio Canada, and say, oh yeah, if we wanted a poll showing a specific result, we'd go get it and we'd pay for it. So the question is this what CTV did?
Well, paying for polls is not out of the ordinary. Political parties pay for polls. Political parties will pay the pollsters to get access to their data sheets. Certain media outlets will also pay for polls. I mean, if we had the money, we could commission a poll. You know what I mean? So it's not shady or illegal, but you do have to ask questions such as, what are your demographics? Were you looking for a specific answer? Would those demographics you're requesting give you a particular answer?
Well, the difference here that I think Dimitri is talking about is some people pay for polls to be done because they're interested in what the results will be. What he's talking about is other people will pay for results.
Well, and I think this is kind of a symptom of modern media culture in general, where instead of finding the evidence and then working towards a conclusion, a lot of people will start with the conclusion and then work backwards to fit the evidence into that conclusion. And I think we saw an example of that yesterday in our video where, you know what, admittedly, we had a certain idea in our head based on the initial evidence we were finding, but then we followed the evidence and found, wow, our idea is wrong.
Right. Now, some people are having their own opinions on that and comments on that, and that's great because that fosters discussion, and discussion is always a positive thing in democracy. But, you know, when we thought about this even further, I said, well, hold on. So Nanos was paid by CTV to actually come up with this sort of poll and potentially this result. What else have they been asked, and who else have they been paid by? So if you didn't know this, this might surprise you. So ladies and gentlemen, it may or may not surprise you that Nanos Research has actually had contracts with the federal government. Now, wanted to just show this as a comparison. So here's the last 5 years under Stephen Harper, and this is the last year or the earliest year that we could actually find data on this. So between 2010 and when he was finished in 2015, Nick Nanos and his research firm ended up with contracts totaling $421,000 from the federal government. Ladies and gentlemen, Justin Trudeau, between 2015 and 2025, $2,527,530. And you can see that the lion's share was in 2023 and 2024 and moving into 2025.
Now, I just want to point out to the audience that you will see it starts at 2015 and goes up to 2025, but at the top says years represented 7. Is because there was no data available for 2016, 2017, or 2018.
And 2021. So, natural question is well, how much has the Carney government contracted now so far? So in just 2 years, they have contracted or issued new contracts for Nanos Research for up to $525 $100,000. And already in 2026, there's $114,000. $410,000 last year was approved by the Carney government.
And it wasn't even a full year.
Right. So what does this all mean? Well, it means Nick Nanos and his research firm, I would say, is in a bit of a conflict of interest when it comes to running this type of poll, personally, because if you are getting millions of dollars for the federal government and those contracts have increased in value over time, is it in your interest to be reflecting polls that show that government disfavorably? I don't know.
Well, one would argue that it's in the pollster's interest to be honest and accurate because that's their literal job as a pollster.
You would argue that, correct. The problem is the perception of a conflict of interest. So when you see the Nanos research firm getting all of this money, it raises questions from Canadians. And then you hear clips from Bob Fife admitting, as a recognized journalist in the Ottawa sphere for decades, that there's a bias against the Conservatives and always has been. Then you have CTV running a story out of Ottawa, talking about a specific poll that they commissioned from Nanos. You hear people like Dimitri Soudis talking about the fact that happens, or it has happened, where people just go to pollsters and say, I want this result, please go get it. And they will ask questions based on the result that they want to get. And then they take all of that and then they present it to MPs and they say, well, based on this poll that we ran, what do you think? This is a lot of loaded framing and it doesn't really prove anything.
Well, and furthermore, it doesn't help the Canadian people.
No. So what we can expect is this bias to continue just based off of what Bob Fife says. What we can expect is there's going to be probably more hit pieces. What we can expect is it's going to be a dogfight in the by-elections that are coming up from the Conservative-held ridings. And what we can expect is a lot of people do not want the Conservatives to take power because of the policies that they're going to be implementing. And when I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of insiders. I mean a lot of liberal-based people.
They won't be getting rich. The gravy train stops.
Right. So this is where Conservatives across the country need to be treating these by-elections like a federal election. Because if you want to see some damage done to Mark Carney's PR train, get out there and vote. And if we don't have to win every single riding, all we have to show is that Liberal support has actually gone down in those ridings since the federal election. And if we can show that, that's a very different narrative than the one that CTV News is posting. So if you're in these ridings, you don't have to do much to have a positive effect on this country and the perception of what is actually going on and the perception of Mark Carney. All you have to do is get in and vote. And if you want to do more than that, you don't even have to be from the riding. You can come in, you can volunteer, you can help folks like Jim Servos in Beaches East York, whomever is going to be the candidate in Brantford Brant, whomever is going to be the candidate in the upcoming by-elections. So don't wait for the next general election to get involved. There's a lot of important by-elections that are going on right now and are upcoming. And this is our chance to give Mark Carney a little bit of a black eye and show Canada that the honeymoon is truly over.